The old books in the university library breathed a dusty sigh of peace, a scent of paper and forgotten stories that was the only real home Arya Ricci had ever known. Outside, the city roared, a beast of steel and ambition, but in here, there was only the soft scratch of her pen on paper and the weight of the scholarship that was both her salvation and her chain. Her goal was simple, wasn't it? She wanted a quiet life, a safe life, a life where no one knew her name. Because of that, she worked until her eyes burned, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate hope for a future she could call her own. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world she didn't belong to, and that was exactly how she liked it. But then, the email arrived. It landed in her inbox with the sterile click of a closing cage door. The St. Jude's Charity Gala, mandatory for all scholarship recipients. A command performance where the poor were trotted out to smile gratefully at the rich who had paid for their education. Her thoughts spun into chaos. The thought of it, of being on display, made a familiar fear coil in her gut. She had to go. She had to stand in a room full of people who saw her as nothing more than a project, a good deed, a box they could tick on their tax returns. How could she possibly survive a night under the gaze of people who owned the world she was so desperate to just exist in? Deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. That night, the ballroom glittered like a beautiful, cold-hearted lie. Chandeliers wept diamonds of light onto women in silk gowns and men whose smiles were as sharp and expensive as their suits. Arya, in a simple pale dress she'd borrowed, felt her invisibility cloak shredding with every step she took on the marble floor. Her one goal was to find a quiet corner, become part of the wallpaper, and count the seconds until she could escape. She clutched a glass of water, her knuckles white. The air thickened with unspoken threats when they approached. A trio of women, their laughter like the clinking of ice in a glass, their eyes like chips of stone. The leader, a blonde named Isabella, whose father owned half the city's shipping, smiled a predator's smile. "Arya, isn't it?" Isabella began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The scholarship girl. It's so brave of you to come. I can't imagine." Arya's breath caught. "It's a lovely event." Her voice trembled but held firm. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "It is, isn't it?" Isabella's friend, a redhead, chimed in, her eyes raking over Arya's simple dress. "We were just talking about how much work it is to find the right gown. But I suppose you wouldn't have to worry about that, would you?" The insult landed, sharp and precise. Arya felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear. But then, it happened. In the span of a breath, Isabella made a theatrical gasp, stumbling forward. A glass of dark red wine, held perfectly in her manicured hand, tilted. The liquid splashed down the front of Arya's pale dress, a violent crimson stain against the soft fabric. Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd. Isabella feigned horror. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry, how clumsy of me." But her eyes were dancing with cruel delight. The other women were smirking. This was no accident. This was an execution. They had spilled wine on her to shame her, to mark her as the trash they believed she was. With every beat of her terrified heart, Arya stood frozen, the laughter of the hyenas ringing in her ears, her dignity bleeding out onto the ballroom floor.
Meanwhile, from a shadowed alcove across the grand ballroom, Damiano Moretti watched. His presence filled the room, suffocating, even though most of the chattering fools in attendance were too terrified to even look in his direction. As if the city itself belonged to him, he surveyed the scene, his eyes missing nothing. This gala was a necessary evil, a battlefield disguised with champagne and string quartets. It was here that his enemies gathered, their civilized masks hiding the rot within. His gaze swept past them all, the corrupt politicians, the sycophantic businessmen, the rival family heads. His eyes lingered for a moment on Marco Valerius, the old snake, who was holding court by the French doors, looking far too pleased with himself. Valerius had been quiet for months, Too quiet, which meant he was planning something. Damiano's focus was absolute, his mind a chessboard of threats and strategies. He was the king, and every person in this room was a piece to be moved or to be crushed. He barely registered the little charity mouse in the pale dress when he'd first seen her. She was insignificant, scenery. But then, he watched the pathetic, cruel theater unfold. He saw Isabella, a daughter of a minor associate, and her cackling friends corner the girl. He saw the accidental spill. He saw the crimson stain bloom like a wound on the girl's dress. And something inside him shifted. It wasn't chivalry, it wasn't kindness. It was rage. Cold, precise, and absolute. It was the same kind of public, sneering humiliation his own family had endured years ago, right before the betrayal that had left his father dead and him an orphan king of a bloody empire. That incident had taught him a critical lesson. Weakness is an invitation, and public disrespect is a declaration of war. What those silly little girls didn't understand was that this ballroom, this city, everything in it was his. And no one was allowed to bleed on his property without his permission. As the silence stretched around the humiliated girl, Damiano moved. He stepped out of the shadows, and it was as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Laughter died. Conversations faltered. Every eye turned to him, wide with fear and shock. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He walked not with haste, but with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator who knows its prey cannot escape. He didn't look at Isabella or her friends. He looked only at the girl, Arya. He remembered her name from the file. Under the weight of his stare, she trembled, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. He stopped directly in front of her. The space between them crackled with tension. He saw the defiant tilt of her chin, the resilience warring with her shame, and it was interesting. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He ignored the gasps, the frantic whispers. His gaze was a physical touch, branding her as he gently, deliberately dabbed at the wine stain on her chest. The gesture was shockingly intimate, a quiet act of defiance against the entire room. Then, and only then, did he lift his eyes. They were obsidian, flat, and utterly devoid of mercy as they settled on Isabella. "I believe you dropped this," he said, his voice a low, threatening murmur that cut through the silence like a razor. He let the stained handkerchief fall from his fingers to the floor at her feet. Isabella paled, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. She looked from the handkerchief to his face, and what she saw there made her take a stumbling step back. It was an accident," she stammered. Damiano's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no humor, only the unspoken promise of violence. "There are no accidents in my city," he replied, his voice still quiet, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Only mistakes. And I don't tolerate mistakes." He turned his back on her, a dismissal more profound than any shout. His eyes found Arya's again. Under his possessive gaze, he offered her his arm. "You're with me now," he stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration of ownership, made before them all. In that moment, everything changed. Arya Ricci, the invisible girl, had just been claimed by the most feared man in the city, and there was no escaping what came next.
The morning after the gala, Arya's tiny apartment felt like the only safe harbor in a storm-tossed world. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a peaceful scene that did nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird beat of her heart. She replayed the night in a dizzying loop, the spilled wine, the cruel laughter, and then him. Damiano Moretti. His dark eyes, the shocking feel of his handkerchief on her skin, the way the entire glittering world had held its breath under the weight of his stare. A shudder racked her body. Deep down, she knew the truth. An encounter like that, with a man like that, was never truly over. He had marked her, and she didn't know what that meant, only that it terrified her. She just had to lay low, disappear back into her own world. Maybe he would forget all about the charity girl in the stained dress. What would a king want with a ghost anyway? But then a knock echoed through her small apartment. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was sharp, precise, and final. 3 raps that sounded like a judge's gavel. Her instincts screamed danger. Her blood ran cold. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peered through the peephole. And her world tilted on its axis. Damiano Moretti stood on her worn-out welcome mat, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who were as still and silent as statues. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking right at the peephole, right at her, as if he could see her, as if he owned the very air she breathed. Her thoughts spun into chaos. Don't open it. He'll go away. But she knew he wouldn't. Men like him didn't just go away. She fumbled with the lock, her hands trembling so hard she could barely turn the deadbolt. The door swung open. He stood there, a vision of tailored darkness against the peeling paint of her hallway. He was even more intimidating in the light of day. "Arya," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a summons. What do you want?" Her voice trembled but held firm. She would not cower. "Last night was a public event," he began, his voice a low, calm murmur that was somehow more frightening than a shout. "In my world, public events have consequences. When I defended you, when I claimed you in front of my rivals and the entire city, I made a statement. My reputation is now tied to your safety, which means your safety is now my responsibility." She stared at him, bewildered. "Responsibility? I didn't ask you to do that. I don't need your protection." A flicker of something, amusement, irritation, crossed his face. "You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice," he said, his tone like cold steel. "You do not. You made a scene in my ballroom, and I cleaned up the mess. That creates a debt, and I always collect." "A debt?" she cried, her voice rising with disbelief. "For what? For being humiliated? For you stepping in where you weren't wanted?" No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make sense of this twisted logic. "The world you understand, Miss Ricci, is a lovely, simple place with clear rules," he said, taking a step into her apartment, forcing her to back away. His presence filled the room, suffocating. "My world is not so simple. In my world, perception is reality. And the reality is you now belong to me until I say otherwise. Because of that, you are a vulnerability I must control." He stopped, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You are coming with me. Now." "No!" The word burst from her, a raw sound of defiance. "No, you can't do this. I have a life here. I have my scholarship, my classes." "Your scholarship," he interrupted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "The one funded by a board of directors who value their health and the health of their families? The one I can have revoked with a single phone call?" The threat landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The scholarship was everything. It was her only way out, the one thing she had earned for herself. It was the foundation of the quiet, safe life she dreamed of. He was threatening to burn her entire world down with a single phone call. In that moment, everything changed. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution of the life she knew.
He watched the fight drain from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, shattered look of defeat. Her defiance had been refreshing. A spark of fire in a world of ash and sycophants, but it was a fire he had to contain. Under his possessive gaze, he felt a flicker of something that was almost regret. He was destroying her little world to protect his own, a necessary act of collateral damage. He had to do this, because Marco Valerius would already have her name, her address, her entire history. The old snake would see her not as a person, but as a weapon to be used against him, a symbol of a perceived weakness. Letting her remain here, unprotected, was a mistake he couldn't afford to make. It's not fair, she whispered, her voice cracking. Fairness is a luxury, Arya, one my enemies don't grant me, and one I, therefore, cannot grant you. He replied, his voice flat. He had to be cold, had to be the monster she believed him to be because it was safer that way, for both of them. You have two choices. You can walk out of this door with me now, and the life you've built will simply be paused. Or you can refuse, and I will erase it. I will make it so the only job you can get is cleaning toilets so that every school in the country denies your application. I will turn your quiet little dream into a nightmare you can never wake up from. He saw the war in her eyes, the desperate, trapped animal looking for an escape that wasn't there. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to have a different kind of fate, one where he could have met her in a library and talked about books instead of debts and threats. But that was a fool's dream. Why? She finally asked, her voice raw. Why are you doing this? Because there are men who will try to hurt you simply to get to me, he said, deciding to give her a small piece of the dangerous truth. Men like Marco Valerius. You are now a piece on a board you don't understand, and the only way I can keep you from being used against me is to control you completely. Without another word, she walked to her small kitchen table, picked up her keys, and turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes were bleak, but her chin was held high. As if pulled by an invisible string, she walked past him, out the door, and into the custody of his men. The moment her defiance intrigued him, he knew this would be a complicated acquisition. Her spirit was not broken. It was merely caged.
The ride was a blur of silent, terrifying speed. The city she knew, the crowded sidewalks, the noisy traffic, the familiar storefronts, flashed by the tinted windows like scenes from a forgotten life. Her world had shrunk to the cold leather of the car seat and the suffocating presence of the man beside her. Damiano didn't speak, didn't even look at her. He just stared straight ahead, a marble statue of power and control. With every beat of her terrified heart, she felt herself being pulled further and further away from everything she had ever known. Then, they left the city behind. The car began to climb, winding its way up a private road carved into the side of a cliff overlooking the stormy gray ocean. Her breath caught. Ahead of them, a set of immense black iron gates opened with a silent, menacing grace. They passed through, and the gates swung shut behind them with a heavy, final thud, a sound that echoed the death of her freedom. The estate was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a fortress of glass and dark stone that seemed to rise from the cliff itself. It was beautiful, impossibly so, but it was a cold, cruel beauty. It wasn't a home. It was a cage. A gilded cage designed to hold something wild. Moments later, the car stopped. A guard opened her door, and she was escorted up a set of wide stone steps to the front entrance. The massive front door, made of a dark, polished wood, swung open. As she stepped across the threshold, from the gray, windswept day into the cool, silent interior, the door closed behind her. The click of the lock was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Her old life was officially over. Her new goal was brutally simple: survive. She stood in a cavernous foyer with floors of polished black marble that reflected the stormy sky from a massive 2-story window. The air smelled of clean, cold stone and something else, something faintly metallic and spicy, like expensive cologne and gunpowder. It was the scent of him. He appeared at the top of a floating staircase, looking down at her, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to your new home," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He descended the stairs, his steps making no sound on the stone. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence a physical weight. "There are rules," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous murmur. "You will not leave the estate grounds. You will not attempt to contact anyone from your old life. You will eat your meals at the times specified, and you will not enter the East Wing. Ever. Do you understand?" She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. Good, he said. He looked her over, his eyes lingering on her face, her simple clothes, her trembling hands. A housekeeper will show you to your room. Try not to break anything, Arya. His lips curved into that cold, terrifying smile. Especially yourself. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted, and she was his prisoner. Arya awoke to silence. Not the gentle, peaceful silence of her old apartment, but a thick, heavy silence that swallowed sound. She was lying in the center of a bed so large it felt like a ship adrift on a sea of white silk sheets. Sunlight, pale and watery, streamed through a floor-to-ceiling window, revealing a room that was more of a suite than a bedroom. The furniture was minimalist and modern, all clean lines and dark wood, and a walk-in closet stood open, revealing rows of designer clothes in her size, a wardrobe for a woman she would never be. This was her gilded cage. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Her one desperate goal was to find a flaw in its design. She had to survive, because giving up was a luxury she couldn't afford. A quiet knock preceded the entry of an older woman in a simple gray uniform. The woman, whose name tag read Maria, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. She never spoke a word, only gestured, to the breakfast tray on a small table, to the bathroom, to the clothes. Her fear was a living thing in the room, a silent scream that told Arya more than any words could. It told her that the bars on this cage were not just physical, they were made of terror. After that, Arya began her exploration. She moved through the cold, museum-like estate, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the polished marble floors. She noted everything. She saw the hidden security cameras in the cornices, the silent guards stationed at the end of each hallway, the fearful deference of the staff. This was a kingdom built on absolute control. Her thoughts spun into chaos as she realized the true extent of her imprisonment. She was a bird with clipped wings given a beautiful cage to die in. Drawn by an invisible string, she found the library. It was the only room that felt remotely alive, 2 stories high with walls lined in dark mahogany shelves groaning with the weight of thousands of books. The air smelled of old paper and leather, a scent of home in a place that was anything but. She ran her fingers over the spines, a desperate touch for a piece of her old life. She pulled out a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, a story of unjust imprisonment and meticulous revenge. How fitting. An ambitious choice. The voice came from the doorway, low and laced with a familiar, dangerous silkiness. Her breath caught. Damiano stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. As if he owned the very air she breathed, he seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. "It's a classic," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but a defiant spark ignited within her. She would not let him see her fear. He walked toward her, his step silent. "It is," he agreed, stopping just a few feet away. The space between them crackled with tension. It's a story about a man who believes he can control everything: fate, revenge, the lives of others. He builds an empire on his pain. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers. But he forgets one thing. An empire built on pain will always, eventually, crumble from within. You can't cage a soul without poisoning your own. She didn't know what scared her more, his words or the flicker of raw, ancient pain she saw in his eyes before it vanished. What kind of man saw a story of hope and revenge and only saw the poison? This was an open loop, a question she couldn't begin to answer. "Is that what this is?" she dared to ask. "An empire of pain?" His face hardened, the mask of the dawn sliding back into place. "This is my home," he said, his voice cold steel. "And you are my guest. Remember that." Without another word, he turned and left, the unspoken promise of violence hanging in the air behind him. Arya stood there, clutching the book, her mind reeling. She had just seen a crack in his armor, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that looking for more would either be her salvation or her doom.
In the sterile quiet of his security office, Damiano watched her on the monitors. A wall of screens showed him every corner of his empire, every hallway, every door. He was a god here, all-seeing and all-powerful. But then his gaze would land on the screen showing the library, where she now sat curled in a leather chair, lost in a book. She was a glitch in his perfect system, an unpredictable variable. She was not a victim, not a pawn, not a simple prize. She was something else. She is a risk, Damiano. Luca, his consigliere, stood beside him. Luca was a man from the old world, his father's most trusted friend, his loyalty etched into the lines of his face. His presence was usually a comfort, a link to the past, but lately it felt heavy. She is a guest, Damiano corrected, his eyes still on the screen. A guest you brought here by force, a civilian, Luca pressed, his voice a low grumble. Valerius will see her as a weakness. The men are already whispering. They see a beautiful woman, and they think the dawn is getting soft. What my men think is my concern, not yours, Damiano snapped, a rare flash of anger breaking through his control. Deep down he knew the truth. Luca was right. She was a weakness. But the thought of getting rid of her, of sending her back out into the world where Valerius could get his hands on her, stirred a violent, possessive instinct in his gut. He needed to test her. He needed to see the steel he'd glimpsed in her eyes. She will learn the rules, he said, his voice flat. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. Silvio, send a message to the kitchen. We will have a formal dinner tonight. All of my capos will attend, and Miss Ricci will be the guest of honor. He then strode from the security room and found her still in the library. Under the weight of his stare, she looked up, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. There is one more rule, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The east wing of this house is forbidden to you. You will not go there. You will not ask about it. Is that understood? He watched her absorb the command, saw the spark of curiosity in her eyes. He knew he had just painted a target on that very hallway. Hours later, he watched on his monitors as she walked down the main hall. She stopped just at the edge of the corridor leading to the east wing. She stood there for a long, silent moment, her posture a clear challenge. She didn't cross the line, but she let him know that she knew the line was there, and that she was the one choosing not to cross it. A defiant retort died on her lips, but her actions spoke volumes. For a man who demanded absolute obedience, her quiet, strategic defiance was both infuriating and utterly captivating.
The dinner was not a meal. It was an interrogation. Arya sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, directly to Damiano's right. The room was filled with his lieutenants, his capos, hard men with broken noses and eyes that were either empty or filled with a predator's cunning. The air thickened with unspoken threats, the clinking of silverware on porcelain the only sound for long stretches. Her goal was to be a ghost, to eat without tasting, to listen without hearing, and to survive. But one man, a brutish, barrel-chested capo with a scarred face, had other plans. His name was Silvio. So, Silvio began, his voice a gravelly rumble, leaning forward on his elbows. You're the little stray the dawn brought home. What's your story? Your family owe us money? His question was a challenge, thrown across the table like a bloody gauntlet. Arya felt Damiano tense beside her. She knew this was a test, not only from Silvio, but from him. I don't have a family, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Silvio smirked. Even better, no attachments. So what do you do, little bird? Sing for your supper? The other men chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Something inside her shifted. The girl who had frozen when wine was spilled on her was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone who had spent days breathing the air of this cage and was learning its brutal language. She looked directly at Silvio, her gaze level. I study history, actually, she said, her tone conversational. I find empires fascinating, especially how they fall. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. They rarely fall from outside attack. It's almost always a weakness from within. A trusted advisor who gets too ambitious. A soldier who thinks he's smarter than his king. Rot. It starts from the inside. The silence that followed was absolute. Silvio's face flushed a dark, dangerous red. She had not only insulted him, she had, in this world of coded language, accused him of disloyalty in front of his Don. She had used his own aggression and turned it into a declaration of her allegiance to the man beside her. Damiano was perfectly still, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. She had played the game, and she had, for a moment, won. The rest of the dinner passed in a thick, tense silence. She had survived. She had passed the test, but she had also made a powerful enemy. As the men began to file out of the room, their voices dropped to hushed, serious tones. Arya remained seated, pretending to be absorbed in folding her napkin, her ears straining. "Valerius is getting bold," she heard a voice mutter. "That shipment at the docks was a message." "A message Damiano will answer in blood," another voice replied. "But the old man is slippery. We hit him, he hits us back." The words sent a chill down her spine. A botched shipment. A man named Valerius. The abstract danger of her situation was suddenly becoming very, very real. The rot was not just a story in a history book. It was outside the walls of this fortress, and it was clawing its way in.
The call came just after midnight, a shrill cry in the tomb-like silence of his office. Damiano answered, his knuckles white around the phone. The voice on the other end was strained, reporting losses. Not just cargo, not just money, but men. His men. Marco Valerius hadn't just sent a message with the dockside ambush. He had signed a death warrant. A cold, familiar rage began to build in Damiano's chest, a precise and patient fire. This was the consequence of the old man's ambition, the inevitable result of a snake testing the bars of its cage. Valerius thought him young, thought him reckless. He was about to be reminded that the most dangerous predators are the ones with everything to lose. "He's testing your control, Damiano," Luca said, stepping into the office. His face was a mask of grim concern, but his eyes held a glint of something else, a strange satisfaction. "The families are watching. If you let this stand, if you show anything less than overwhelming force, they will see it as weakness. You must crush him, not just for the attack, but for the disrespect." Damiano stared out the vast window at the churning black ocean below. The water was restless tonight, just like the city. "I am aware of my duties, Luca," he said, his voice a low growl. He saw the rot Arya had spoken of at dinner, the whispers of disloyalty, the challenges to his power. He had to cut it out at the root because an infection like Valerius, left untreated, would poison his entire empire. He had built this kingdom on a foundation of fear and respect, and he would not see it crumble. He turned from the window, his decision made. "Get Silvio on the line. I want 2 of Valerius's warehouses turned to ash by sunrise. I want him to know that for every man of mine he touches, I will burn a piece of his world to the ground." His command was absolute, his voice leaving no room for debate. It was a declaration of war. As Luca left to carry out the order, Damiano's gaze drifted to the security monitors. In the soft glow of the screens, he saw her. Arya. She was in the library again, curled up in a chair, asleep with a book in her lap. She looked small, fragile, a splash of innocence in his world of calculated violence, and a cold dread, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, coiled in his gut. The war wasn't just in the city anymore. By bringing her here, he had placed her directly on the battlefield. Not only that, he had made her the most valuable target. What good was burning down a warehouse if Valerius could simply reach out and extinguish this one? Small light? The thought was unacceptable. He had to protect her, because protecting her was now the same as protecting himself.
Arya woke with a start, though she couldn't say why. The estate was silent, wrapped in the deep stillness of the pre-dawn hours. Yet the air was different. It was thin, sharp, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Her instincts screamed danger. She slid out of bed, her feet cold on the hardwood floor, and crept to the window of her suite. The grounds below were bathed in the blue-gray light of the moon, empty and still. But then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the garden wall. Not one of his guards, something else, something wrong. Without warning, the world erupted. It wasn't a loud explosion, but a series of soft popping sounds, thoup, 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 like champagne corks being opened in another room. The silenced gunfire was followed by the shattering of glass somewhere downstairs. A shrill alarm began to blare, a scream that tore through the house's oppressive silence. Her breath caught. This was it. The rot was inside. Her door burst open. It wasn't one of the attackers, but a guard, his face grim, his gun drawn. "Stay here! Don't move!" he commanded before disappearing back into the hallway, his shouts swallowed by the chaos. Her thoughts spun into chaos. Was this her chance? Could she escape in the confusion? She looked at her window, at the sheer drop to the cliffs below. There was no escape. There was only the cage and the fight that had just broken into it. As the silence roared in her ears, her bedroom door was kicked in, splintering the wood. A man dressed in black, a ski mask covering his face, stood there. His gun was raised. A black hole pointed directly at her heart. She was going to die. But then, a blur of motion. In the span of a breath, Damiano was there. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, inhuman. He threw himself in front of her, a human shield, just as the attacker's gun flashed. Arya heard a sickening, wet thud. She heard Damiano grunt, a sharp, ragged sound of pain. He didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He launched himself forward, a predator unleashed, and the fight was over before it began. There was a brutal, efficient series of movements, a sickening crack of bone, and then the masked man was on the floor, unmoving. Silence fell again, thick and heavy, smelling of gunpowder and blood. Damiano stood over the body, his chest heaving. Then he turned to her. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but it was the dark, wet stain spreading across his shoulder that made her stomach drop. He had taken the bullet meant for her. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He wasn't her captor, he wasn't the Don. He was the man who had just saved her life. The moments after were a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Damiano sagged against the wall, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain. The untouchable king was wounded. He was bleeding. He was human, and he was bleeding for her. Deep down, she knew the truth. Her survival and his were now tangled together in a bloody knot. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a raw rasp, his eyes scanning her frantically. "Me? You're the one who's been shot," she cried, rushing forward. Her fear for herself was gone, replaced by a desperate, shocking fear for him. We have to stop the bleeding." He looked down at his shoulder as if just noticing the wound. "It's nothing," he gritted out, but even as he said it, his knees buckled. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see him as a monster in that moment. Before she could move to help him, guards swarmed the room, their guns up, their faces a mixture of fury and panic. A man with a medical bag pushed past them. "Get her out of here," Damiano commanded, his voice weak but still filled with authority. A guard took her arm gently. "Miss, please." They led her from the room, but not before she saw the medic cutting away Damiano's shirt, revealing the raw, bloody wound beneath. The sight was seared into her mind. They put her in the library, the one place she'd felt a sliver of peace. But now its silent books felt like witnesses to a nightmare. She paced the floor, her mind racing. Who was this man? Was he the cold-hearted tyrant who had stolen her life, or the protector who had just risked his own to save it. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and pink, he found her there. His arm was in a sling, his face pale and etched with exhaustion, but he was alive. He walked in and simply stood there, watching her. The silence stretched, thick with everything that had happened, with everything that was unspoken. He looked lost. The iron control was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability she had never seen. He closed his eyes for a moment and his hand, his good hand, clenched into a fist. "Sophia," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. It was so quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it. It wasn't directed at her. It was a word torn from a deep, hidden place, a place of pain. He looked at her then, his eyes dark with a grief that was ancient and terrifying. "They should have never touched you." Her breath hitched. He wasn't talking about her. He was seeing someone else, a memory, a ghost from a past tragedy that this night had resurrected. Who was Sophia? The question was a hook, an open loop that pulled her deeper into his dark, violent world. He had just given her a piece of his shattered soul, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she would never be able to give it back. The estate was a wounded animal in the days following the attack. It was quiet, but it was the heavy, listening silence of a predator licking its wounds. The shattered windows were replaced, the blood was cleaned from the floors, but a phantom chill remained. Arya watched Damiano from a distance. He moved through his kingdom with a renewed, cold-blooded focus, his arm in a sling, a stark reminder of the violence that had breached their walls. But she couldn't unsee the crack in his armor, the raw pain in his eyes when he had whispered that other woman's name. Sophia. The name was a ghost that now haunted the hallways with her. Her thoughts spun into chaos. This wasn't just about business or territory anymore. She knew it in her bones. The attack had been too precise, too personal. It was meant to wound him, not just his empire. Deep down, she knew the truth. To survive this, she could no longer be a passive captive. She had to become a player. Because of that, she took the biggest risk of her life. She found him in his office, standing before the massive window that overlooked the sea, a glass of amber liquid in his good hand. The silence stretched as she entered. He didn't turn, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat. "That man, Marco Valerius," she began, her voice trembling but held firm. "This is about more than a shipment at the docks, isn't it? The attack on this house, and it felt different. It felt like he was trying to recreate something, like he was trying to psychologically torture you." He turned then, slowly. His eyes were dark, searching, stripped of all pretense. The air thickened with unspoken threats, but for the first time, they weren't directed at her. "What do you know?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "I know what I see," she pressed on, her heart hammering. "I see a man who is being haunted. Who is Sophia?" The question hung in the air between them, a shocking, intimate violation. For a moment, she thought he would throw her out, or worse. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. But then, something inside him shifted. He looked away, back at the stormy ocean. "Sophia was my sister," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat. "She was younger than you, 17. He told her a story then, a brutal fairy tale of another time. A story of a gala, a supposed truce, and a car bomb planted by Valerius's father that was meant for his own. A bomb that had taken his father, his mother, and his little sister instead. "Valerius knows the details of that night," Damiano finished, his voice raw with a grief that time had not touched. "He attacks me on the anniversary. He targets things she loved. He uses her memory as a weapon to unbalance me." Arya felt a profound, aching empathy for the monster before her. This wasn't just a mafioso. This was a man forged in the fires of an unimaginable loss. "He thinks your grief is your weakness," she whispered. It was, he admitted, his gaze meeting hers, intense and burning. Until now. In that moment, everything changed. He was no longer just her captor. He was a man who had just handed her the broken pieces of his past, a trust more valuable than any jewel in this gilded cage.
Her insight was a blade that cut through years of his hardened defenses. No one had ever seen the pattern. Not Luca, not his most trusted men. They saw strategy and warfare, but she saw the ghost in the machine. She saw the pain that drove him. As if he owned the very air she breathed, he felt a pull toward her that was more dangerous than any rival dawn, because this was a connection he couldn't control, couldn't threaten, couldn't command. He decided to trust his gut, to trust her. Valerius thinks he is the master of this psychological game, Damiano said, a new, cold fire in his eyes. We are going to use his own strategy against him. For the next week, they worked. In the deep quiet of his office, she became his shadow, his strategist. He gave her access to files, to the histories of the rival families, to the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that defined his world. She absorbed it all, her sharp mind seeing connections others had missed. Not only did she understand the business, but she understood the people. She understood their pride, their greed, their fears. He was the sword, she was the strategist, and together, they were the storm. Using her insight, they crafted a trap. They leaked false information about a new shipment, one supposedly containing priceless artifacts, the kind Sophia had loved to study. It was a piece of bait, designed specifically for Valerius's obsession, and the old snake took it. The ambush was a spectacular success. Damiano's men were waiting, and Valerius's crew was decimated, his reputation taking a significant blow. It was a victory, a clean, decisive win that sent a clear message to the other families. But victory in their world always came at a price. The next evening, a small, unassuming envelope was delivered to the estate. It was addressed to him. Inside, there was no letter, no threat. There was only a single, high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of Aria's old apartment building, taken from across the street. In the window of her former apartment, a single red rose had been placed on the sill. The unspoken message was terrifyingly clear. I can touch your world. I can touch her past. I can touch whatever and whoever I want. As the fear coiled in his gut, a possessive, primal rage, unlike anything he had ever known, consumed him. Valerius hadn't just threatened him. He had threatened her. He had put his filth on the one clean thing in Damiano's world. Aria came into the office then, her face pale. She had seen the photo. He saw the terror in her eyes, the realization that her old, quiet life was now a weapon to be used against her. Damiano, she whispered, her voice trembling. He will not touch you, Damiano swore, his voice a low, guttural promise of violence. He will not touch your memory. He will not touch anything that is yours, because everything that is yours is now mine. He would not just defeat Valerius, he would erase him. For this violation, he would salt the very earth his rival walked on. The attack on the estate had proven one terrifying thing. He had a traitor in his house. The information had been too good, the assault too well coordinated. The space between them crackled with tension as he realized he couldn't trust the very walls of his fortress. He couldn't trust his guards. He couldn't even trust Luca, who had been strangely quiet, his advice suddenly feeling hollow. There was only one person he could trust, the one person who had nothing to gain and everything to lose.
He came to her room that night, his face grim. "Pack a bag," he commanded, his voice urgent. "A small one. We're leaving." Her heart leaped into her throat. Leaving? Was he letting her go? But the look in his eyes told a different story. This wasn't freedom. This was flight. "There's a mole in this house," he said, answering her unspoken question. "It's not safe here anymore. Not for you."
He drove them himself, in an unremarkable black sedan. leaving the estate under the cover of darkness. They drove for hours, into the mountains, the city lights shrinking behind them until they were nothing but a faint, dirty glow on the horizon. They arrived at a small, isolated cabin nestled deep in a forest of pine trees. It was a safe house, a place off every map, known only to him. It was sparse, with a stone fireplace, a simple kitchen, and one bedroom. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and rain. Here there were no guards, no cameras, no empire. There was only the two of them, the storm raging outside, and the one raging between them.
The forced intimacy of the small cabin was suffocating, exhilarating. There were no more roles here, no Don, no captive. They were just a man and a woman, stripped bare by danger. They built a fire, the crackling flames the only sound besides the wind howling through the trees. He cooked for them, a simple meal of pasta, his movements precise and focused, even with his arm in a sling. They ate in silence, the unspoken tension a living thing at the small wooden table.
After they ate, he stood by the window watching the rain lash against the glass. He could feel her watching him. "My father trusted the wrong man," he said, his voice rough. "He brought a traitor into his house, and it cost him everything. It cost me everything." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing in the firelight. "I will not make the same mistake."
She walked toward him, as if pulled by an invisible string. Her fear was gone, replaced by a deep, aching need to understand the man who had saved her, imprisoned her, and bled for her. "I'm not going to betray you, Damiano," she whispered.
"I know," he said, his voice hoarse. Before either could speak, before thought could poison the moment, he closed the distance between them. His good hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. Under the weight of his stare, she leaned into his touch. It was a surrender. And it was a victory. The climax of weeks of fear, defiance, and simmering desire finally erupted. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, hungry kiss. A kiss that tasted of whiskey and rain and a darkness she was no longer afraid of. It was the kiss of a man starved for something he didn't know he needed. It was the kiss of a king claiming his queen, not with force, but with a raw, broken vulnerability.
In that moment, the lines didn't just blur. They were erased completely, consumed by the fire they had ignited. Her world tilted on its axis as she kissed him back, pouring all her fear, all her confusion, and all her terrifying, undeniable love for this dangerous man into the embrace. There was no escaping what came next.
Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets of the single bed, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, he held her close. He felt a peace he hadn't known since he was a boy. But even in this sanctuary, the rot of his world crept in. He knew he had to tell her the rest. He had to give her the final, brutal piece of the puzzle. "The man my father trusted," he whispered into the darkness, his voice heavy with a lifetime of hatred. "The one who set the trap, the one who walked away and left my family to die. It was Luca's father, and I've always suspected Luca knew more than he ever let on." For 12 hours, the safe house in the woods was a sanctuary, a world outside of time where he was not a don and she was not a captive. It was a fragile, stolen peace, built in the heart of a storm. Lying there in the dark, with Aria asleep in his arms, her soft breath a quiet rhythm against his chest, Damiano felt the ghost of a man he might have been, a man without an empire of pain. But the sun rises even on stolen days, and the world outside doesn't wait. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, a serpent's hiss in their temporary Eden. It was Luca. "We have him." Luca's voice was tight with grim satisfaction. "I got a tip from one of my sources. Valerius is meeting his top lieutenants tonight at a private hangar at the executive airport. He's planning to flee the country. This is it, Damiano. This is the kill shot. But we have to move now." The peace shattered. The weight of his crown came crashing back down. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to finally end the blood feud that had defined his entire life. He had to go back. "We're on our way," he said, his voice hard. He looked at Arya, her eyes now open and watching him, filled with a sleepy trust that twisted something in his gut. "It's time to end this," he told her, and for the first time, the this felt like a future he was fighting for, not just a past he was avenging. They returned to the estate as the sun set, the sky bruised with purple and orange. The air in the house felt different, charged with a cold, electric tension. His men were mobilized, a silent army preparing for war. He left Arya in the library, giving her a look that he hoped conveyed "wait for me." Then he went to his office to meet Luca for the final briefing. The source was impeccable, Luca said, handing him a thick file. He provided everything: proof of Valerius's escape plan, his offshore accounts, and this. Damiano opened the file, and the world stopped. It wasn't financial records. It was a series of high-resolution photographs. The first few were of Arya, taken weeks ago before the gala. She was on a city street sitting at an outdoor cafe, talking and laughing with a man Damiano recognized instantly, Rico Falcone, one of Marco Valerius's most vicious and trusted lieutenants. Then came the bank statements. A shell account in a foreign bank under a name he didn't recognize, with deposits made weekly for the past 2 months. And the final page, a wire transfer confirmation, depositing a massive sum into that same account just yesterday. The transfer was from a holding company owned by Valerius. The air left his lungs. The room began to tilt. The file in his hands was not just evidence, it was a ghost. It was the ghost of his father's trust, the ghost of his family's murder, the ghost of a betrayal so profound it had shaped his entire existence. "Where did you get this?" he managed, his voice a dead thing. "The source," Luca said, his face a mask of regret. "He said Valerius has had her on the inside from the beginning, that the whole charity girl story was a setup. She was his weapon all along." No, it couldn't be. Not after the safe house, not after the look in her eyes. But the proof, the photos, the money. It was all there. His deepest, most primal trauma roared to life, consuming everything: logic, hope, trust. He saw his father's smiling face, then his body, bloody and broken. He saw the traitor who had stood by his father's side, professing loyalty. And now he saw Arya's face, her wide, innocent eyes, and he saw a lie. A beautiful, perfect lie that had almost cost him everything. A cold, black rage, so absolute it felt calm, settled over him. He walked out of the office and into the library. She was there, by the fireplace, and she smiled when she saw him. A genuine, hopeful smile that now looked like the most grotesque mask he had ever seen.
He stood in the doorway and the hopeful smile died on her lips. This was not the man who had held her in the safe house. This was not the man who had whispered his family's secrets into her hair. This was the Dawn, a terrifying stranger whose eyes were as flat and cold as a winter grave. Without a word, he walked to her and threw the file onto the table. The photos and papers scattered across the polished wood. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for a photograph. She saw herself, weeks ago, having coffee with her university mentor, a kind old professor who had helped her with her scholarship application. But the caption beneath it, scrawled in red ink, read, "Arya Ricci, meeting with Rico Falcone, Valerius enforcer." Then she saw the bank records, the numbers that meant nothing to her, and her name, or a version of it, typed on the statements. I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at him, her heart splintering. "Damiano, this isn't real. That man is my professor." "His name is Rico Falcone," he bit out, his voice a low, threatening murmur that vibrated with a barely contained violence. "And he has been on Valerius's payroll for 20 years. Was it all a game, Arya? Was the gala a setup? Was the fear an act? Tell me." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "When you were in my bed last night, was that for him too?" The accusation was so monstrous, so vile, it stole her breath. Shock, then a soul-crushing wave of heartbreak washed over her. "No," she gasped, tears blurring her vision. "No, you know that's not true. You know me." "I know nothing," he snarled, straightening up, his face a mask of cold fury. "I know only what I see, and I see a traitor, the same way my father saw a friend." He turned his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. "Guards!" he called, his voice echoing in the vast room. Two of his men appeared instantly. "Take her to her room, and lock the door." Her world shattered. The man she had let in, the one she had inexplicably fallen in love with, was gone. And in his place stood the monster she had feared all along. As the guards took her arms, she watched him walk away, his back as unyielding as a tombstone. The gilded cage had slammed shut, and this time the bars were forged from his broken trust and her broken heart. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a silent, lonely torture. She was a prisoner again. But this time, there was no hope, no defiance, only a hollow ache in her chest. The luxurious suite was a mockery, its beauty a constant reminder of the ugly lie he believed. One afternoon, she heard a commotion in the hallway. She peered through the keyhole and saw Maria, the quiet, kind housekeeper, being escorted out by two guards, her face streaked with tears. Luca stood watching, a look of cold satisfaction on his face. She had lost her only friend in this house, another casualty of the Don's cold, blind rage. The cruelty was the point. It was a message, meant for her. It meant she was utterly, completely alone. That night, alone in the suffocating silence of her room, she finally broke. The fight was gone. The hope was gone. She curled up on the cold marble floor, the silk dress she wore feeling like a shroud, and she wept. She wept for the life she had lost, for the man she thought she'd found, and for the fool she had been. She had believed a monster could have a heart. She had let herself fall in love with her own destruction. She had flown too close to his dark, burning sun and had fallen. Her wings turned to ash. As a single, hopeless tear traced a path down her cheek, she gave up. There was no escape. There was nothing left to fight for. The game was over, and she had lost.
His empire felt like a tomb. He had his victory. Valerius's organization was in flames, his lieutenants were either dead or in hiding, and the city was his, undisputed. But his throne felt cold, his office empty. He sat in the dark, the damning file spread across his desk, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. He stared at her picture, the one from the cafe, her face full of a light and life that he had personally extinguished. He should have felt vindicated, triumphant. Instead, he felt nothing. A vast, hollow emptiness where a fragile, dangerous hope had started to grow. His victory was ash in his mouth. He picked up the photograph again, staring at it, forcing himself to see the traitor. But his mind, the cold, strategic machine that had built his empire, snagged on a detail. A tiny, insignificant, maddening detail. The photograph was dated 2 months before the gala. 2 months before he had ever laid eyes on her. Why? Why would Luca's source have been investigating a random penniless scholarship girl 2 months ago? It made no sense. It was a loose thread in a story that was otherwise perfectly woven. His thoughts spun into chaos. His gut, the instinct that had kept him alive for years, was screaming at him. Screaming that he had made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. He looked at the evidence again, at the clean, perfect story it told, and then at the one, tiny, illogical detail that unraveled it all. With a roar of rage and dawning horror, he swept the contents of his desk to the floor. Glass shattered, papers scattered like dead leaves. He stood there, panting in the ruins of his certainty, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He had been so sure, so utterly, righteously sure, and he had been a blind, trusting fool all over again. The traitor wasn't the girl he had locked away upstairs. The traitor was still walking the halls of his home. The rage was a cold, clarifying poison in his veins. It was not the hot, explosive anger he used to crush his enemies, but a self-loathing so profound it burned away all the fog. The loose thread, the date on the photograph, had unraveled everything. He had been so consumed by the ghosts of his past that he had willingly let a new one walk right through his front door. He was his father's son, in the worst possible way. He had trusted the wrong man, and he had broken the one person who had ever seen the man behind the monster. His movements were swift, precise. He went to the security room, locking the door behind him. The wall of monitors seemed to mock him with its all-seeing gaze. He pulled the raw footage from the day Luca had presented the evidence. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his mind a cold, calculating machine once more. He cross-referenced Luca's movements with the estate's floor plan, tracking him hour by hour. And then he found it. A 15-minute gap. A camera overlooking the corridor to Luca's private study had been inexplicably offline for exactly 15 minutes that afternoon. A technical glitch that was no glitch at all. That was all the proof he needed. The rest was a formality. He hacked into Luca's encrypted files, a skill he hadn't used in years, and the final damning pieces fell into place. Encrypted texts to a burner phone. Financial transfers funneled through shell corporations, all leading back to Marco Valerius. The betrayal was absolute. A serpent he had let coil at his hearth for years. Luca hadn't just been a traitor. He had been a patient, venomous spy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Arya had been his weapon. But the rage was a secondary emotion. Beneath it was a chasm of raw, soul-deep regret. He had to go to her. The walk from his office to her suite felt longer than his entire life. Each step was a hammer blow of his own failure. He had promised to protect her, and instead, he had become her tormentor. He had locked her away, thrown her love back in her face, and left her to shatter in the dark, all while the real snake whispered poison in his ear. He reached her door. He could hear the silence from within, a silence so complete it screamed of despair. His hand trembled as he put the key in the lock. The click echoed in the hallway like a gunshot. He pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted him broke something inside him that he didn't know was still whole. She was on the floor, curled into a ball, the magnificent silk dress he had given her pooled around her like a shroud. Her body was racked with silent, shuddering sobs. She wasn't a defiant queen or a cunning spy. She was a broken girl, and he was the one who had shattered her. "Arya," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. She flinched, scrambling back until she hit the wall, her eyes wide with terror. It was a look that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "Get away from me," she choked out. He didn't move closer. He couldn't. Instead, he dropped to one knee, lowering himself, making himself smaller. He held out the tablet from his security office, the screen glowing with the proof of Luca's betrayal, the texts, the transfers, the missing footage. He slid it across the cold marble floor until it stopped near her feet. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My past, my father's betrayal, it blinded me. I saw a ghost and I let it poison me. I let it poison us." He finally looked at her, his own eyes burning with an agony that mirrored hers. "I became the monster you always feared I was, and I broke the only thing, the only person." His voice cracked. He couldn't finish. "Look at the screen, Arya, please."
His voice was a ghost, stripped of its command, filled with a raw agony that seeped into the cracks of her broken heart. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to hope. Hope was a cruel, sharp thing that had only ever hurt her. But her eyes were drawn to the glowing screen. She saw the texts, the bank records, the timeline that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that Luca was the traitor, that she had been the pawn, that Damiano had been a fool. She looked up from the screen, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. He wasn't the Don. He was just a man, kneeling on the floor of his gilded cage, his face a mask of raw, soul-deep regret. The monster was gone. In his place was the man from the safe house, the one who had whispered his secrets in the dark. "He played you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He used your own pain against you." "Yes," he admitted, his voice thick with self-loathing. "And in doing so, he hurt you. That is a crime I can never forgive. Not in him, and not in myself." He finally took a step closer, his movements hesitant. "I cannot ask for your forgiveness, Arya. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for your help. I am going to destroy them both, Luca and Valerius. But I can't do it alone. I need you. I need your mind. I need the way you see things." He stopped before her, his gaze pleading. "Help me burn their world to the ground." A flicker of something hot and sharp cut through her despair. It was anger, a furious, cleansing fire. They had taken everything from her. They had used her, framed her, and broken her. And they had turned the one man she had let herself care for against her. No, she would not lie here and be a victim. She would not be a ghost in this man's story. She would be the fire that consumed his enemies. Slowly, she got to her feet. She stood before him, the queen of a ruined kingdom, her eyes blazing with a new, terrifying purpose. "No," she said, her voice clear and cold. "We won't just burn their world. We will humiliate them. We will dismantle them piece by piece in front of everyone. We will make them a lesson that the entire city will remember for 100 years." In that moment, a new, unholy alliance was forged in the ashes of betrayal. His office was now their war room. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a guest or a captive. She was his partner, his strategist. She moved with a newfound purpose, her mind sharp and clear. "Valerius and Luca think in terms of violence and money," she explained, pacing before the window. "But their real power, their real weakness is their public image, their pride."
He watched her, a sense of awe cutting through his guilt. She was magnificent. She was a phoenix rising from the ashes he had made. "The mayor's annual masquerade ball is in 2 days," he said, his mind already turning. "They will both be there. It's the biggest society event of the year. It's the perfect stage."
A cold, sharp smile touched her lips. A return to the scene of her first humiliation. The symmetry was poetic. "Perfect," she agreed. "You will handle the violence. I will handle the war." They spent the next 48 hours weaving their trap. She used her knowledge of history and psychology, crafting a plan to attack Valerius's legitimate businesses and expose Luca's treachery in a way that would leave them socially and financially ruined before a single shot was fired.
He put his entire organization at her disposal, his men now looking at her with a new, grudging respect. He trusted her completely, putting his life and his empire in her hands. The night of the ball, a quiet, profound understanding passed between them as they prepared. He fastened a diamond necklace around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. She adjusted his tie, her touch a spark of electricity. They were two broken halves of a whole, now united by a single, deadly purpose.
She looked at their reflection in the mirror. He in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that was both a uniform and a disguise. She in a stunning blood-red gown that was both a statement and a warning. They were a king and queen, ready for war.
As they rode in the back of the armored car, the city lights flashing past, the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with a shared resolve, a trust forged in fire and betrayal. He reached over and took her hand. "No matter what happens tonight," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow, "we face it together."
She squeezed his hand, her fear gone, replaced by a steel-cold anticipation. "They won't see us coming," she whispered. The car pulled up to the Grand Hotel, the same one where she had been shamed weeks before. The music and laughter spilled out into the night. The door to the lion's den was open, and they were walking in. The ballroom was a sea of anonymous predators, their true faces hidden behind masks of velvet and gold. The air, thick with expensive perfume and the murmur of powerful secrets, was the same. Yet everything was different. Weeks ago, she had walked this floor as a victim. Tonight, she walked it as a weapon. Damiano was a silent, lethal shadow at her side, his hand a possessive weight on the small of her back. His presence was a promise of the violence to come, but it was her move to make first. Her goal was not to start a war, but to end one with a single, perfectly aimed cut. She saw them across the room. Marco Valerius, looking like a distinguished elder statesman in a tailored tuxedo, and Luca, his face a mask of loyal concern, standing at his shoulder. They were laughing, confident, completely unaware that they were ghosts, already dead and just waiting for the ground to claim them. "It's time," she whispered, her voice a cool, steady thing she didn't recognize as her own. Damiano's fingers tightened on her back for a fraction of a second. A silent acknowledgement. A promise. "I am with you." As if pulled by an invisible string, Arya began to walk, weaving through the glittering crowd. A woman in a blood-red dress on a collision course with fate. She stopped before Valerius, whose smile faltered for a moment in surprise. Luca's eyes narrowed, a flicker of alarm in their depths. "Miss Ricci," Valerius said, recovering smoothly. "An unexpected pleasure. I see Damiano is letting you off your leash tonight." "He and I are partners," Arya replied, her voice carrying in a small pocket of silence as those nearby turned to watch. "In fact, we were just discussing our latest joint business venture, Valerius Shipping." The old man's smile froze. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Of course you don't," Arya said, her tone deceptively sweet. "Because you've been so busy defrauding your own investors, you've likely lost track. You see, when you've been cooking the books for 5 years, funneling money through shell companies registered in the Caymans to cover your gambling debts, the details can get so messy." She held up her phone, the screen glowing with a single damning document, a leaked ledger she and Damiano had paid a fortune to acquire. "This is a list of every investor you've stolen from, Marco. Men in this very room. I wonder how they'll feel when they learn their trusted partner has been robbing them blind." In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. It was a masterstroke. She hadn't accused him of being a mafioso. She had accused him of being a common, pathetic thief. She hadn't attacked his power. She had attacked his pride. Gasps and angry murmurs erupted from the crowd around them. Valerius's face, a moment ago so confident, turned the color of ash. He was ruined. Not by a bullet, but by a whisper. But then, the chaos she had unleashed took a violent turn. Before either could speak, Luca moved. With the speed of a cornered snake, he lunged, not for Valerius, not for an escape route, but for her. He grabbed her, yanking her back against him, and the cold, sharp edge of a knife pressed against her throat. "Nobody moves!" Luca shrieked, his composure shattering into pure animal panic. "The girl comes with me." Her breath caught, the cold steel a razor's kiss against her skin. This was it, the moment where it all ended. But the girl who had frozen under the weight of spilled wine was long gone. In the span of a breath, while all eyes were on Luca's knife and Damiano's thunderous face, she acted. Her hand shot out, grabbing a half-full bottle of champagne from a passing waiter's tray. With a guttural cry of rage, she swung the heavy bottle backward, smashing it into the side of Luca's head. There was a sickening crunch. Luca screamed, his grip faltering for a single, crucial second. And that was all the time the devil needed.
He watched her performance with a cold, burning pride. She was magnificent. She was a queen, dismantling his enemy with words as sharp as any blade. But the moment Luca laid a hand on her, the world turned red. A primal, possessive rage, so absolute it felt like a religious calm, descended upon him. His men, already in position, moved as one, creating a wall of bodies that separated the chaos from the rest of the party. The guests screamed, a symphony of terror that was music to his ears. Luca's mistake grabbing her was his last. The moment Arya stunned him with the bottle, creating that single heartbeat of an opening, Damiano closed the distance. He moved through the chaos as if it were standing still. He ignored Valerius, who stood frozen in shock. He saw only Luca and the unforgivable sin of his hand on Arya's skin. There was no grand fight. There was no struggle. There was only the end. Damiano's hand shot out, grabbing Luca's wrist and twisting it with a sharp, brutal crack of bone. The knife clattered to the floor. Luca howled, but the sound was cut short as Damiano's other hand closed around his throat. "You," Damiano snarled, his voice a low, threatening murmur that was somehow louder than all the screams, "should have never touched what was mine." He did not grant the traitor a quick death. No, that was a mercy Luca hadn't earned. He made sure Luca looked into his eyes as he ended it, so the last thing the traitor ever saw was the face of the king he had so foolishly betrayed. Silence fell over the scene of carnage. Valerius was on his knees, surrounded by Damiano's men, his reign over. Luca was a broken thing on the floor, and they, Arya and Damiano, were the only ones left standing. In the immediate aftermath, the world was a cacophony of sirens, flashing lights, and the frantic whispers of the city's elite. The empire was his. The war was won. His victory was absolute. And he felt nothing but a cold, desperate need to get to her. He pushed past his own men, his eyes scanning the chaos until he found her. She was standing a few feet away, her breathing ragged, a single, perfect drop of champagne glistening on her cheek like a diamond teardrop. He ignored the bodies. He ignored the whispers. He ignored the empire he had just secured in blood and fire. He walked directly to her, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the champagne. His gaze was a physical touch, branding her, searching her for any sign of fear, any crack in her magnificent armor. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw, stripped of all its power, leaving only the man. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the chaotic flashing lights, and she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Good," he breathed, a universe of relief in that single word. He pulled her against him, his good arm wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, a mix of her perfume and the metallic tang of battle. He knew in that moment, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had not just won a war for his family's legacy, he had won a war for her. Because without her, the throne, the city, the entire goddamn world was just a cold, empty room.
Months later, she stood on the balcony of the estate, a glass of wine in her hand. The night was cool and quiet, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of fallen stars. The mansion was no longer a cage. It was a fortress. It was their fortress. The air no longer smelled of fear, but of home. The glass doors slid open, and Damiano came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own home. The darkness was still there, a part of him she had come to understand and even cherish, but it was now tempered by a light she had brought into his life. "My contacts in Tokyo have agreed to the terms," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "But they have concerns about the new shipping routes. They think it leaves us vulnerable to the triads. What do you think?" She smiled. He wasn't just telling her his plans, he was asking for her counsel. He valued her mind, her insight, her perspective. Because of that, she knew their partnership was real. "I think," she said, leaning back against him, "that we should invite their leader here. Show him our strength. Show him our unity. People are less likely to attack a kingdom when they see that the king and the queen rule as one." He was silent for a moment, and then he chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through her. "An empire of two," he whispered. He turned her in his arms to face him. Under his possessive gaze, which was now filled not with cold ownership but with a fierce, profound love, He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the safe house, but a deep, searing kiss of promises fulfilled and a future they would build together. He was a monster, forged in fire and betrayal. She was a girl who had been raised to be invisible, but together they had faced the rot of their world and had built something new in its place. He was not her captor, and she was not his captive. He was her king, and she was his queen. And this was their empire.